we'll get started, and then anyone else that's joining, is can just jump in. But look, thank you everyone for joining the event. Hope everyone's looking forward to it. So as I'm sure you've all received messages from Xcede and Fabric, but we're very much delighted to host this webinar this afternoon. Obviously the Xcede recruitment group partnering with Fabric, specifically with Dan and Rick, to basically do a sort of an hour Q&A session all around mastering GA. So we've received all your questions. Thank you for everyone for sending over all the questions that you did. We had a really good response rate with everyone wanting to find out different things. So how we're gonna do this is I've sent all the questions beforehand to Dan. Dan has sort of grouped the questions into kind of 4 to 5 main topics. So we're going to go through each of those topics within the presentation, and then there should hopefully be sort of 10 to 15 minutes at the end for any more questions, in which case what we'll do is we'll get people to sort of raise their hand and hopefully get the sort of final couple of questions or follow-ons over to Dan and Rick. It's also worth mentioning to everyone that Dan and Rick are both happy to actually share these slides with everyone, so there's sort of no need to take notes or anything, and then afterwards if you get in touch with one of us or both of us, then we'll be able to share that with you. So hopefully that will be super useful as well. But we'll get started. As I said, I'll do a quick introduction to Xcede just in case anyone's unsure exactly who we are, and then Dan and Rick will get started with the main event. This is just a really brief slide into Xcede about what we do. So Xcede are a recruitment agency. We're a global agency, so we've got offices in 4 continents, across the UK, across Spain, South Africa, Singapore, the US, Germany as well, and we place around 2,500 candidates annually. Well, that was the number we reached over last year, and we have over 180 recruiters within the business. And how everyone works is everyone is a specialist within our field. So I've been at Xcede for 5 years. My focus and specialism is kind of within this digital analytics, products and marketing growth analytics field, which is why I was really keen to host this event alongside Dan and Rick, in order to just give a bit more back to the digital analytics community, and so that everyone can understand a bit more specifically, obviously, around this GA4 migration that's happening and will continue to happen, I'm sure, over the next couple of years. These are our main specialisms I mentioned. So split up into data, product, software, cloud and cyber. If we're looking at the grid, I'm sitting in that little corner of that digital and product analytics spectrum within data, but that's just a bit of an overview about all the main areas that we cover here at Xcede. And then this is a snapshot of the data team. So hopefully everyone can see this clearly, but I think what this hopefully shows is that between the team here, there's years and years of experience, specifically within the data and analytics field. So if there are any areas that you or your teams want to discuss or want to find out a bit more, then hopefully between the 10 of us, that we've got plenty of years of experience and know-how from a recruitment side, but also an understanding of the market and the industries of the sectors. So as I said, if there's anyone across any of these areas that you want to speak with, then please feel free to connect with them on LinkedIn, contact them, or if you want to contact me, and I'm more than happy to loop you into any of our consultants here. Here's our most recent salary survey. So this was actually released a couple of weeks ago, and this is basically using all the data that we collected from the last 12 months, over 3,600 vacancies across various different industries. If people have their mobile phones out or want to follow the QR code, then you can do that. Hannah's kindly just put it into the chat as well. So hopefully that can give you all a bit of an insight just around salaries and where you think your position or where you might want to be benchmarked over the next couple of years. This is it is an estimate. So obviously within that, the salaries will fall sort of 5 to 10% below each band, but hopefully it gives everyone a good indication of what the market is saying and exactly where people feel that they need to be on that side of things. Perfect. And now I will pass over to Dan and Rick to give their introduction into themselves and into Fabric.
Cool. Thanks, Bailey. So firstly, thanks for everyone's great questions. So I appreciate those coming through. I think, like Bailey mentioned there, we've kind of categorized them into 5 areas where we go into a bit more detail. We don't normally do a session like this, but because the questions are so grouped in around the differences between GA4 and GA3, some of the attribution challenges, something about BigQuery, we've tried to group it into those kind of sections. So we've got a few slides on each, which we'll happily share afterwards. We've then got what we're kind of calling the quick fire questions, which, should be quite exciting. And as we go through the deck, if we've got time, we'll answer any questions that people want to ask in the Q&A section there. So if you've got any further thoughts or questions, or I've not quite explained something quite right, please shout up, and then Bailey will just tell me to, look in the Q&A section and we'll kind of cover that off. But yeah, as we go through, we've got 2-3 slides on who we are as a business, mainly to give context around our credibility in this space, but also just again to showcase some of our areas of expertise where we can help in this very, let's say, challenging time of GA4 and the adoption that is happening in the industry, and kind of the fun and the kind of interest that brings across. So agenda is really simple: who we are, some background to GA4, and then your questions answered, right? So just give some background on Rick. We created Fabric in January of this year. We both worked at a large Big Six network agency, but we essentially headed up their data analytics and conversion team. Between Rick and I, we grew the team from roughly 0 to 400 people, and we were Google's biggest partner. And our whole business approach is to weave data into the heart of the business, specifically focus around GA4, whether that be training, implementation, media optimization, attribution, etc., etc. So I'll obviously, send these details on, but again, it's for credibility, really. I've been around the Google marketing platform space for 15 years or so, and like I say, I headed up the Google marketing team for Dentsu specifically, and we're the largest reseller and service provider of the technology across Europe by some distance. So we believe we're in a great position to help as Fabric, a small, nimble, dedicated web analytics agency that can really help with some of your challenges around GA4, which I know from the questions that we've received, there are many, in fact. So I'll let Rick just do a brief introduction to himself, and then we can crack on with some of the questions.
So yeah, hi everyone. It's actually good to see some familiar faces in the lobby today. I wasn't quite expecting quite as many people as we got, so that's good. But for those of you that don't know me, I'm Rick Riley. I'm also a co-founder of Fabric, and considered to be the tech lead over at Fabric. My background is more on the technical side. I've spent 15 years in the industry. Originally started out as sort of graphic designer before getting into web development, and eventually into data and conversion rate optimization. So again, I spent much of my time and career working with Dan, in the agency space, helping grow the data and analytics team and conversion team. So yeah, that's me in a nutshell. I'll keep it brief because I know that we've got quite a lot to get through. So yeah, that's me in a nutshell.
Awesome. Thanks, Rick. So we're coming to the questions, right? So thanks everyone for sending these through. We kind of grouped the first set of questions into GA4 versus GA3 metric changes, or what has actually changed. I think for us it's quite surprising. We've got 44 days that we're kind of, GA3 is going to turn off and GA4 is going to be enabled unless you are a 360 client. So we thought we'd spend a little bit of time on some of the metric changes, some of the differences in how the data is collected, and some of the differences around what is or isn't staying. So again, we hopefully give quite a simple explanation of that. And like I say, these slides will be shared on, and we tried to make it as simple as possible, because I think some of the questions we received were around how do I understand this information, and then how do I actually explain this to other people in the organization. So it's quite a big thing, right? But obviously this all goes back to the initial point around the robust configuration of GA4, right? This is something that it's fundamentally important. So obviously we're talking about discrepancies and differences between 3 and 4, but the clear thing is to understand, is your GA4 configured correctly? And I think certainly the clients we work with, if you were to ask them, are they confident in the data? The answer is no. So that's the first thing to say. Look at that process across everything from privacy, streams, GTM access and e-commerce, etc., and make sure that is set up as good as it can be, because that's the most fundamental part when you're trying to look at those two data sets. But it's really important to understand that it is actually a totally different collection method. So when people are looking at, it doesn't match my GA3 or doesn't match my GA4, these kind of there isn't that it's easy to compare that one or the other, so there is going to be a difference between those two numbers. But the way to think about it is that GA4 is an entire new code base. GA4 works from a point of hit levels and events. It's everything is an event now in GA4, which is interesting because Google are moving towards this privacy first narrative around collection, whereas previously they kind of had these categorization of a session, hit, user and product. So obviously it's moving entirely to GA4. So when you're trying to look at metrics and comparisons, some of the comparisons aren't even possible or even useful because it's moving to an entire new code base and a tracking methodology. So again, we'll send this on so you can kind of peruse over that. But I'll kind of come on to the next few slides. And this really is important to get your head around, because some of the fundamental things that we use as practitioners, whether that be a marketer or an analyst or anybody else in the business, those metrics are changing. So some of the key metrics are changing across 3 and 4, right? So 2 fundamental things around traffic volume. So your sessions are changing and your users are changing. Again, 2 primary metrics when we think about how we understand how many sessions or people, it's not people quite, but how many sessions or what's the volume driven to my website. These numbers are changing. So normally you'd see much higher sessions in GA3 versus GA4. A lot of our clients are seeing a big difference, anything from 5 to 25% of a drop in sessions. That's because GA3 categorizes a session very differently. So in the example here, we've got if a person comes to your website via a PPC ad, and then in that same session re-enters the site using an affiliate code or a voucher website, GA3 would capture that as 2 sessions, but GA4 captures it only as 1 session. And that is irrelevant how many times they actually come through to the site back and forth. If it's in the same session, GA4 will only ever record 1 session, which is quite a fundamental change if you're a website that does a lot of email campaigns, basket abandonment campaigns, affiliate campaigns. There's big changes, so you expect to be quite a big drop in sessions. But what's interesting is that GA4 pins that session as far as traffic categorization goes to PPC. So it would add volume as paid search to the site because that's how they first got to the site. Whereas historically in GA3, because they're all individual sessions that are generated every time someone enters via a new traffic source, you'll get very different allocations of traffic. And this ultimately impacts a lot of volume through affiliates, which has historically, generated high volume, high revenue. This is basically being categorized as how they first entered the site, whether that be SEO or paid search. So sessions are changing, right? And it's totally normal to see a higher sessions in GA3 versus GA4. One of the points to note is that if you aren't seeing higher sessions in GA3 or versus GA4, that may be because of GA4's inability to be able to filter out bot traffic and fake traffic. So what I would do is try and take a look at the countries, territories, cities and towns that is coming from, because by default, naturally, by how consumers consume websites or look at websites, the GA3 number should be higher, but that will be a reason why. The second metric is changing, there's users. So Google has changed this new methodology of active users, right? So it's moving from users to active users. And there's some key fundamental differences here in terms of how that's collected. So active users are users that don't leave the site after an interaction. So historically in GA3, if somebody comes to the site, they are triggered and captured as a user. That's fine. But in GA4, they have to trigger an event to be captured. So if somebody comes onto your landing page and leaves within 5 seconds because they've consumed the content they needed, GA4 doesn't record them at all, where GA3 does. So again, you're going to start to see this lowering and discrepancy of numbers between one and the other. And also, if you've got the kind of the data enabled from a Google Signals perspective, I'll come on to talk about that in a moment. It also dedupes users across multiple devices. So, as a simple example, if I'm logged in into my Gmail or my YouTube on my phone and then my desktop, and I've got the right permissions accepted, and I've consented via consent mode, and you're collecting me as you should, Google will class me as one user, even though I'm on multiple devices. So there's some differences here around some of the key metrics that are changing, and obviously they have knock-on effects. So for example, conversion rate. So conversion rate is going to go higher because you're getting less sessions, right? So there's all these metrics that are going to change internally that need some education in the next month or so to to understand as marketeers, as e-commerce people, these numbers are going to change specifically. So just another quick one on key metrics. So you've got here bounce rate, right? The title's a bit dramatic. Like bounce rate does exist in GA4, but it's buried in the explore section, as by default you get this engagement rate. So, and that's really interesting because this is the inverse of bounce rate. So engagement rate is essentially sessions that interact with your page. But again, back to the point really around Google being very trigger happy, GA4 being very trigger happy with events, it actually creates a really interesting or different view of traffic performance. So you can see here that all the traffic sources on the right hand side have such a large engagement rate. In our view, it's very difficult to understand the quality of traffic based on this new engagement rate that Google are moving towards with GA4. So it's not that one is right or one is wrong. It's just that the metric is changing from bounce rate to engagement rate. So, you know, again, all the methodologies there, but the reality is that you are going to see very different numbers for traffic source and traffic source quality as it's driving through the site. So they're the kind of some of the key metric changes. Like I said about the conversion changing and a few other bits and bobs as well. It is important to note that these are very important when it comes to understanding traffic performance. So the second set of questions we got were around attribution. And again, this has always been an interesting debate, an interesting topic around the performance generally. I'll come back to the questions in a second. Or if we get some of the end, I will answer as many as I can. I just want to get through the content that we've got. So thanks very much for Gavin. So 1 second. So attribution, right? So these are the kind of questions we've got around attribution. So, you know, what are the differences between attribution? Why are we going to DDA? Is model data changing, et cetera, et cetera? So firstly, we've got to understand, you know, attribution. What is it in GA4 at the moment? So basically, Google are in September a full attribution model. So first click, they are dropping all of those as solutions. So you're only left with 3 possible options when it comes to attribution. So those are cross-channel data-driven, cross-channel last click, which is basically how GA3 works now, and then ads preferred last click, which I know this is being recorded, but I think nobody should be using ads preferred last click because it essentially gives all preference to paid media, which obviously isn't a true reflection of a contribution to a conversion. So these are the 3 things that are going, and Google's view is that less than 1% of the people who use GA3 actually use any of the other models anyway. So when it comes to attribution, this whole point is moving to data-driven attribution, which is a really, really interesting way of thinking about things. So rather than looking at last touch, this looks at assigning the right amount of credit for each channel that contribute to the journey. But unlike GA3, that number goes up to 50 touch points. So if you've got a long tail purchase, like a holiday, like a car, it includes 50 entry points across the channels that you're talking about, whether that be paid media, display, email, whatever channels you're running, it includes 50 points. And what it does is it, rather than crediting everything to email in this example on the right hand side here, it gives the right amount of credit for journeys that aren't necessarily historically been given credit at all. So it takes all the data that you have and it's unique to your account and applies machine learning models, which is game theory, and it creates a Shapley value for each one of these individual traffic sources. And what that means is that each of these traffic sources is credited a proportion of the sale. So when you look at the attribution reports in GA4, it will actually have a strange thing here. So you can see on the right hand side here, you've got this 0.78 of a conversion or 0.15 of a conversion. That's because using the DDA modeling or data-driven attribution modeling is changing across, you know, from a last click to a you know, proportion of the sale, right? So you see some really interesting numbers or changing numbers across attribution. So by default, DDA or data-driven attribution is included in all of the reports. So rather than just you know, just last click like it is now, but you can have this model comparison so you can see like for like. This is taken directly from Google's demo account, because obviously we can't share any client data, but we'll just give you a flavor. And like I mentioned before about the traffic categorization, session volumes, and everything being set up as you know, as you might expect. A lot of the accounts at the moment, we're seeing this unassigned or referral or cross network, and the categorization isn't quite as you would expect in GA4. So that's one of the areas you really need to get right in terms of the setting up a custom channel grouping, really. So that kind of explains a bit more attribution. I think the way to think about this is that, you know, it is an interesting mix because it basically gives more credit to upper funnel. So obviously things that historically haven't driven, you know, or got a right proportion of credit, like, you know, brand activity, it will start to garner that information and put that into a, you know, a reasonable model for you to understand, you know, performance versus it just being last click at the moment. So yeah, cool. So the next set of questions is around BigQuery. So I'm going to hand over to Rick, and I'm just going to dive into the questions and try and fire out an answer. So there you go, Rick.
Well, so BigQuery is such a big topic, and we're only going to breeze over it here. You could easily spend an entire day or even week covering the nuances of BigQuery. But we couldn't do a GA4 session without mentioning it. So again, I think that the best place to start is what is BigQuery for those people that are not familiar with it. And in a nutshell, it's a cloud-based data warehouse, and even simpler than that, it's basically a huge spreadsheet in the cloud, or a huge database in the cloud. And a lot of people just see this as a method of exporting Google Analytics data, or raw Google Analytics data, but it's so much more than that. I think that the main purpose of BigQuery should be to merge other data sets in with your Google Analytics data. And I think that that's where you can get the highest amount of value out of it. But the purpose of it is to crunch through huge data sets in you know, a matter of seconds. You know, there's a client that I worked with that had their entire forecasting for retail and e-commerce all sat within a spreadsheet. Now that spreadsheet was 500 megabytes in size, and it would take, you know, a standard laptop about 5 minutes to even open it. But what BigQuery would be able to do, if that data was sat up there, you could query that data and bring back a result in seconds. So again, we worked with that client to move some of those processes across to something like BigQuery, so that again, you can crunch through it. But another example of how I've seen BigQuery used is that same client merged weather data in with their retail and Google Analytics data. And it's not quite as simple as on this particular day it was sunny. You know, how do we match that up against sales? Because even up and down the UK, it can be sunny in London but rainy in Manchester. It's frequently the case. So he had to pull, or we had to pull weather data for city locations and then match that up within BigQuery. And then we can pull that out to get a result to see how weather affects purchase, you know, not only in you know, bricks and mortar stores, but also on e-commerce websites. So you know, there's a lot of applications and a lot of crunching that you can do with BigQuery. And you know, I think you would be missing the point if you only use it just for Google. So on to the next slide. So a word of warning is, as you move Google Analytics 4 or connect it with BigQuery, and I would recommend that everybody does that. I think in most cases it will be free to set up a BigQuery account and connect this to Google Analytics. And the sooner you can do that, the better, because it only starts capturing Google Analytics data from that point. You can do a backfill, but it's a larger job. So if you've not done that, I would just set it up. It's quite easy to do. But the word of warning is some of the attribution and data modeling stuff that Dan has just mentioned. Be aware that a lot of the modeling that Google can apply to the web interface won't actually port across to the BigQuery data. The BigQuery data will be raw data. So we've had a lot of feedback from clients saying that their BigQuery data isn't matching what they're seeing in the interface, and they're looking at the two. But more often than not, it will either be modeling has changed that data within the interface, or there's been an element of sampling on that data in the interface as well. So again, just be aware that it may not perfectly correlate with what you get within your web interface. And once you've got BigQuery up and running, you need a method of being able to visualize that data. And I think there was a question of what do we recommend around this? So we'd recommend looking at the top three. That's Looker Studio, which is provided by Google, and I think there are benefits to going down the Looker Studio route because of the direct connection in with BigQuery. But also, I'm a big fan of Power BI, which is the Microsoft Data Viz product, and Tableau, which is the Salesforce owned data visualization product. But these can be amazing, and there's a lot that you can do with these packages. But don't go into one of these packages lightly, just thinking that it's easy to build reports. It can be quite tough, and I'd thoroughly recommend almost writing down what you want from a data visualization first before going into one of these packages. And there is a massive learning curve with this, and actually you usually find that you get one person that can be particularly creative, that can display and visualize these things, and then you get the data people that are typically not quite as strong visually. So to get that blend of expertise, it can be pretty difficult. But again, it's something that I would definitely recommend people look at, and these are the three tools that we would recommend to get there as well. So that's BigQuery in a nutshell. There's a lot more to cover on BigQuery. If you have any questions, drop them into the chat. But yeah, we'll kind of leave it there for BigQuery.
Thanks, Rick. So I'd get through a few there. Like I said, if we've got time, we'll rattle through the questions there. Because there's a difference between a user and an active user as well. So that might actually answer some of the questions that are in the chat about bounce rate and about session versus user versus active user. So again, Google aren't necessarily making it as easy to get these metrics as they might do. But that I think is just an interesting point around bounce rate generally. So Rick and I'll do our best to type an answer just now as we kind of rattle. And if you want to have a look through types of answers back, Rick, because just with.
I will do, yeah.
So the next set of questions are around privacy and governance. So I think there's a point here around consent mode. There's a point here around collection methodology and cookieless future. So we spent a bit of time talking about these things here because again, it's interesting to hear these questions from many clients. It's obviously some are in the infancy of scaling. Some are really big that during this course. So it's quite good to kind of get a good gauge where the market's at. So not a lot of people know this, but there are two types of data within GA4 that are captured: consented first-party data and then modeled data. So model data is powered into the account from those users that don't consent to being tracked. So when you see a cookie message, assuming everything is configured as I said at the start, in terms of being compliant, being in terms of GDPR and Google terms, assuming they say no to this, Google still puts information into your account. But like Rick mentioned there, this doesn't actually include it in your raw unaggregated data in BigQuery. But a lot of people don't know there's two types of data that go into the account. But obviously when you look at the account, it just comes up as one data set, right? But some of this is modeled, right? So when you kind of set up configure the account, you obviously got three options to choose what data you want in the account. So three options here. You've got blended, observed, and then device-based. So device-based is basically as GA3 is now. It's, as it says on the tin, device-based. It will track mobile, desktop, and tablet, and apps ultimately very separately, and ultimately give you a lot of kind of like for like, should you wish to. The market is moving towards this blended data, which is a combination of all of Google's data sources from deduping users, all of the Google Signals piece, which I'll talk about in a moment, and then model data. So model data is essentially powered by machine learning, and AI. And yes, I appreciate that's an overused word, and everyone's kind of saying those words when they don't really have an answer to, less than things happen. But clearly what's happening in every client's account is that it's taking proportions of actual data that happens unique to your property and then piling that into the account. So the way to think about this is that Google take away a holdback period. So they take your actual observed data, what happened across your entire data set, take a holdback group or a subset of that information, and then they essentially mix that with the volume of users that said, no, I do not want to be tracked, and then apply the exact behavior from this holdback group into your account. So when you look at your account, you look at the volume, you look at the conversions, you look at anything, traffic sources, a proportion of that is model data. And the only way to understand the difference between model data, the only way to understand how much is model data is to look at your BigQuery export, which is your raw data of observed data, and then your current account. So you can obviously get a gauge of if it's 10%, 3%, 20%. And obviously this swing massively changes depending on vertical, demographic, all these other things. Again, assuming you have consent mode set up, right? Which I'm hoping most of you do. But again, any questions about that, just reach out, because we appreciate it's a bit of a tricky area. So within the account itself, that's how model data works. So I'm not sure why it's whipped back there. So that's kind of, we talked about that model data, how it all works, right? The next kind of thing we wanted to rattle through was sampling, signals, and thresholding. So there's kind of group of questions around what are Google Signals, what are data discrepancy issues, how does threshold work, are the cardinality issues, right? So again, these are some of the kind of common questions we get around GA4. So there's obviously sampling, right? So sampling is essentially where you will look at the interface in a bespoke way, and then because of the processing applied to the kind of segmentation, it spits out a result, but that result is a proportion of reality, really. So when you see this little kind of the percent, if you hover over it, it will give you this is based on X number of samples here. So this actually increases 10 million events for GA4. So if you're analyzing data set bigger than 10 million events, you would then start to get sampled data. So that's when sampling applies. And like I said, the example here simply around the kind of the 100-acre area of trees, it essentially is that same principle. So if you look at the 20% accurate present and much else that up to proportion of the data, but the reality is it's as accurate as the sample size, right? So but that kind of sampling still does apply to GA4, and that's when it kicks in 10 million events for the users of the free version. So but all of the interface now in GA4 is actually unsampled. So whenever you look at your standard reports, that data is never sampled, even if you apply segments or secondary dimensions to the data, which again is very different than GA3. The second you put a segment on it, the second you do analysis, it then gets heavily sampled. Where GA4, they are now allowing you to have the interface itself. So anything you see in your kind of library collections, which you can create, is all unsampled, right? Which again presents much more opportunity for analysis, better analysis, and better validity of the data. So people get confused between sampling and thresholding. So sampling is obviously your full data set. When you talk about analyzing that, thresholding applies where Google thinks you can start to infer individual or small groups of data on a particular user, right? So all the demographic information that Google Signals collects, like gender, age, interest, it obviously starts to threshold that data when you start to get close to an individual or a group of individuals, right? So if you see thresholding limits applied or the information removed, is applying thresholds from a privacy and a compliance perspective. So sampling and thresholding are different. but it's always powered by what's called Google Signals. So again, when it comes to configure the account, you can enable this, check in with the legal team, or to make sure you are compliant. But Google Signals is all that great information that Google has on your users, right? So you can get access to the, information here, such as mail, such as gender, such as users' age, users by interest, and ultimately you can start to look at using audiences across a Google Marketing Platform with this information, or you can start to look at a whole host of additional information around site performance by some of these metrics. So, like I said, I'd just double check before you go enabling it. This is complete with your privacy policy, and then website. Ultimately, when users consent, you can obviously use this information. So there's some kind of questions on Google Signals specifically. So a title on this is quickfire. I'm not sure if any questions have come through while I've been waffling away. So yeah, model data is a new feature in GA4. Model data didn't exist in GA3. Totally new. So thanks, Abs, for that question. So quick fire question. So we've got kind of picked up 5 of the other questions that existed, right? So thanks for this one. So do you happen to know if Google have a shared GA4 development roadmap, right? So there's this one here, which is, it's less of a roadmap, it's more of like what's come out of this at the time. So obviously you can sign up for all of their updates here, and here's a link. So kind of click on there and it'll be able to give you a list of what's happened, but also what it means for you and your account, because a lot of things have come out in the last, I don't know, coming out weekly at the moment, which is keeping us on our toes from an agency perspective. But sign up to that and see what you think. I think into the actual development roadmap, only partners really get access to that, which obviously we're in contact with Google, but a lot of the time partners are under NDA, so they can't really share with clients unless they're part of the alpha or the beta. So obviously, I mean, for example, we were the first. Rick and I worked on the Specsavers account in 2019 when GA4 was in beta and alpha in a system called App Plus Web. It wasn't even GA4, so things like that happen, but only for Google partners. So, but again, reach out if you want us to talk about the roadmap with you and what that looks like. So, yeah. Pros and cons for Google Signals, just seeing that pop through. So, the reality is a lot of people already have Google Signals enabled in their GA3 account. So, I can only see it as pros, because unless you're breaching your kind of privacy and data collection rules, the pros outweigh the cons massively, just from understanding consumers to your website. Making audiences more efficient, you can start to find people who have a certain amount of interest, or if they're in market for things as well. So like holidays, you can then start to target users who are browsing certain sites, who have a certain age, who your target customers, and then find lookalikes on those audiences from Signals. So anything anything like that definitely enable. So we've got a question about implementing e-commerce for GA4. So Rick, I don't know if you wanted to talk about that.
Yeah, I'll cover this, because actually I think that these 2 interpretations of this particular question. So I think that implementation of e-commerce events and doing it via GTM, there is a link below here, which is to Google's documentation and best practice approach to this. I'd encourage that where possible, people do use the Google developer documentation, since if you abide by their data schema, it will make it much easier for implementation. Otherwise, you might need to start looking at manipulating that data within GTM to change it into a format that Google Analytics 4 is going to understand. So I'd recommend that you stick by these guidelines. But the best practice approach for this would be to implement a proper data layer that it basically abides by the GA4 schema. But I've got a feeling that this question might be, if you don't have a data layer, how do you do this via GTM? And it is possible, but it's not something that we would recommend. So the way that you can do this is that you could scrape the page, for instance, for a product title or a product name and a product price, and you could feed that into GTM and then push that back out to GA4. Now, it is possible to do that. We wouldn't recommend it, and the reason being is that once you start going down that path, any slight change to the website design or the hierarchy can actually break that. and then you can end up with holes in your data, which is why we would thoroughly recommend that you have a data layer that's consistent on the website, so that if you do decide to update the design or change those pages or make any change that you want, that data layer can remain consistent, and use that data layer to push events into GCM that's then going to push it out to GA4. So yeah, hopefully that all makes sense, and I think I've covered both bases with that question.
Thanks, Rick. And thanks for the questions that are coming through. They're really valid questions, especially the one around exporting GA3 data. I think at the moment, obviously, everyone's kind of, depending on where your GA4 setup is, everyone's kind of panicking about that in terms of legacy data. I mean, Google are committing to that GA3 data for being available for 6 months to view only, though. So, yeah, there's different approaches around the validity of that data. You know, whether you want to keep it or not. And what that looks like. So, but again, it's, you know, happy to reach out and have a chat if anyone's struggling. Like there's different approaches, right? So yeah, I think this is probably the biggest, most challenging one for us. I think the first thing is every business needs to get their head around metric changes, needs to get their head around how their interface is going to change, how their reporting is going to change. I mean, obviously, we refers to some of Looker quota information, which means some of the stuff that was possible before is no longer possible, especially around some of the discrepancies around that exist now with GA4 and Looker, which is obviously a frustration. But stakeholder management is very important in this phase. You know, obviously a lot of our clients are trying to understand, are my sessions going up or down? A lot of our clients are trying to get, you know, VC investment, are trying to look after, you know, the city and they're interested in the website performance. But the reality is early communication, have a simple document with, you know, almost like a simple table, which is like, our GA3 said this in sessions, our GA4 is going to say that. The average fall is 5%. You know, as a heads up. And the same with things like marketing performance. Clearly things like affiliates, because of the DDA, because of the data-driven attribution on performance, you are going to see a difference in affiliates and get more credit to your upper funnel channels, which have less, you know, less focus of conversion or last click perspective. So the key is to really understand what metrics are going to change, and those obviously are sessions, users, conversion rate, bounce rate and engagement rate, right, alongside a couple of others, but educating the business internally around what it means, because obviously you don't want someone looking at your report and being like, my performance is terrible because my sessions are down 20%. Early education is very important, especially for people who don't have the time to understand the minutiae of the detail. So a simple one pager about GA3 versus GA4 for your business, and like I say, it's not a one rule fits all, because those discrepancies or the differences can be anything between 5 and 25% from the clients we've kind of seen historically. So that's basically the key there. And just a question around, given the number of bugs and limitations in GA4, do you think they'll sunset on time? Good question. I think, you know, it's fair to say that Google, this has been force is the wrong word, but it's been expedited because of the privacy changes. I think it's because they're very worried. They're very worried around the potential legislation challenges or changes as time goes by with relating to EU or kind of data processing. So that's why it's been expedited, because this is a privacy first solution, and they're gearing up for cookieless solutions. So basically, eventually, in theory, when cookies die, if they're eventually deprecated, which they're saying they will be, all the data will be modeled. So kind of geared up a solution that it will all be modeled data, and that's kind of where they potentially could go. So Rick, I'll let you answer the next one.
Yeah, so how will segments work in GA4, and can you share these with others? So again, an interesting question. It's not quite as simple as it should be. So anyone that's dived into GA4, you might have seen that we no longer have that huge segment bar that sits at the top of most reporting. Actually, in reports, that's been replaced with something that Google call comparisons. I describe this as not a replacement for segments, but I think that this is a method where you can quickly produce some throwaway analysis. So let's say if you're in a report and you quickly want to look at mobile versus desktop, then comparisons is perfect for that. Or you want to compare paid search and organic traffic comparisons is fine. The problem with that is that these comparisons disappear once you leave the reporting section of GA, and you will have to recreate them when you go back in. And that's why I say it's handy for quick fire analysis. If you want to check something and produce a quick comparison, that's great for that. But what you can do is you can share these. So if you're within a report and you build out, several comparisons, there is a link that you can share from those reports, and it will include those comparisons within it. So if you wanted to share that analysis, then you can do. But if it's something that you regularly look at, if it's a segment or a comparison that you're always going to be coming back to, then what I'd recommend is you're probably better producing either a completely new report that includes those filters and cards within that particular report, or produce an exploration. So again, explorations is, for those that are not familiar, is almost GA4's replacement for custom reports. And again, confusingly, within explorations, you do have segments. So segments do exist within explorations, and you can create these reports with segments in them. However, these segments, once you've created them, you can't share them. You have to create them per exploration. So again, what I would recommend that you do is if it's something that you're coming back to regularly, create your exploration, bake those segments within there, and then share that report. I do actually quite like the way that explorations, you can share this as at a global level now. So if you create a custom report or an exploration, there's a button to share that with everybody that has access to that property. Just be aware that everybody will see it. But yeah, that's the way that I would use it. And no, unfortunately, there isn't a method of being able to currently share those segments. But I do think that it's something that Google will take a look at. And I think you will be able to share those at some point. But I think that this is Google's attempt at trying to cut down endless amounts of segments that sit within properties, and try and cut it back and make sure that Google Analytics is more reporting focused than getting convoluted with what's segments. So hopefully that answers that question.
Thanks for the questions. Keep them coming through. And like I say, Rick and I'll try to do our best to rattle through some of those in the chat as well. So we kind of finished up on this one in terms of, look, how can GA4 support data aggregation and predictive analytics? So its whole mantra, or kind of the mantra it's going for, is privacy and being cookieless focused, and ultimately providing some element of out of the box machine learning or out of the box predictive analytics. So by default, it will start to give you a ton of audiences or segments, which give you things like lifetime value predictors, predicted spend over the next 7 days, likelihood of churn, all these other kind of elements and audiences, right? So it is geared up to do that. I think what's really interesting is that in the interface, it has baked in predictive analytics. So for example, if you're looking at a data set, there's a little button in your Explore which you can tick, which says, show me anomalies. Or is this data set based on a group of anomalies that, historically you might have drawn conclusions from? So, it is geared up in that way. But, the predictive analytics element, again, we've got to be very careful, because both the attribution methodology that it's using, data-driven attribution, and the predictive elements of the segment it creates are all black box. Sounds quite dramatic, but it is not open in the sense of you being able to actually get access to how it's powered and created. The only way you could potentially do it is export it in BigQuery and apply your own modeling. The problem with that is obviously it doesn't include your model data. So there is some element of skepticism, I suppose, from the industry around Google's black box approach to this, because clearly you don't know if there's some kind of additional weighting towards paid media or some of Google's channels. But that's how it supports predictive analytics and data aggregation, really, because it has a lot of built-in functionality. So that kind of covers off the a lot of the content what we have. Like I say, in the deck that we'll share afterwards, it's got all of this plus some of our client case studies or whatever. So we'll do our best to try and whiz through a couple more questions in the time. So keep piling them through in the chat, and we can go through. So yeah, I think the exploration one is very interesting. About part of our frustration is if a client's got multiple properties, 20 or 30 properties, then the kind of the manual effort to replicate some of those reports, because there's some limitations within the explore section. So, but you should be able to, Sarika, hopefully I'm saying your name right, when you're saying you can't access some of the same dimensions, which dimensions are you talking about specifically? Because there's so many frustrating like gotchas in the explore section. So say for example you look at default channel grouping, there's two. There's one in attribution and there's one in session reporting, and the same with source, the same with medium. There's basically two of those. So a lot of the time you'll catch yourself popping those in the Explore reporter, and then it comes back with nothing, and you have to look at it really closely because you've actually selected the wrong metric. So it'd be good if you could share some of the Google Ads dimensions. Okay. It depends on what those. I assume that you've linked with correct AdWords count and things like that. So, but again, fire the kind of examples through to me and Rick after this, and we can maybe take a look at that. So, Matt's question around, do you see that happen in regards to getting some sort of views functionality within GA4? I hope so. I really do hope so, because the kind of, it is frustrating, to be honest. Obviously, you've got all of your partner traffic, your developer traffic, your bot traffic. It's frustrating, I think, for us not being able to filter the account properly. So I really hope so. So yeah, I mean, obviously, again, we can't share too much about the roadmap from an NDA perspective, but we're hoping that something changes quite quickly with that, because it is a frustration in terms of accurate data. So yeah, no, anyone's trying to do segments, anyone's trying to do filters, sorry, at the top level property view, it's just upsetting, isn't it? Especially even basic stuff like lowercase filters on like site search, and all the kind of hygiene stuff you used to be able to do is no longer very difficult. There are certain workarounds in GTM, but the problem is that you kind of look to create all these workarounds in GTM, and then they'll be on the roadmap the next week. So it's quite frustrating. So and then the confidence level with model data, it's a good question. I think it's kind of unknown as such, in terms of, the reality is it is a proportion of your own data. Google do take your actual data, your property data, and do apply that to, your account. So it's not inferred. It is actually based on a subset of your actual user data scaled up. But I think the question is, if that subset of data has an over reliance on, say, email, or has an over reliance on, a certain type of traffic source or a certain average order value, then obviously becomes, can dilute the actual quality of the data overall. But I think the key is to understand what proportion of your account is actually model data. So get the BigQuery export, look at total sessions, and then get your interface report and look at total sessions, and that'll give you a gauge of what % is modeled and what % is not modeled. So, and again, I can't stress enough, enable consent mode. So many of our clients that we've looked at over the past kind of 6 months or so, they have a cookie message, but it drops the cookie anyway and just carries on collecting. So they have a message which says, do you accept cookies, yes or no? And people think but the reality is that a lot of our businesses we're working with still collect that information, which is again not compliant. So try and enable consent mode, because that will be, obviously make you more compliant. And yeah, again, get you some of that good model data that does exist. So hopefully that answers your question. Gavin's just reading through any more. Yeah, the Explore reports are frustrating to not be able to do that. But some of the API, some of the Google API functionality will also help long term with management of, GTM accounts and properties or whatever. But again, it depends on the kind of scale of the setup, really, whether that's useful. But Google obviously has an API which can start to do some of the configuration or set up reports at big scale. So, Rick, do you want to talk about debugging events in GA4?
Again, it's a difficult one at the moment because I think that debug, the events debugging mode is fantastic. You know, I love going in there and checking how things are working ahead of publishing them in GTM. It makes it so much simpler. However, there are bugs that everybody should know is that anybody that's been in there and played about with it, you might see multiple events firing when they're not. So just be aware of it. If you have a quick search on Google, you'll find a lot of other people with the same issues, but it is a bug that Google are aware of and kind of working on. So yeah, once they can get that sorted, it will be a very useful tool, that debug mode. But I just wanted to mention Mark's question around the exploration report frustration and having to copy reports and also it getting quite unwieldy with people that have already shared reports. That is something that I know Google are looking to address and provide more control around it for that reason. But I'd recommend looking at your permissions within Google Analytics as well across the teams and making sure that you know the right people have access to be able to share those reports at that level and make sure that it's all kept in order. But yeah, that's me.
Awesome. So go on, Bailey. Do you want to wrap it up and then we'll?
Yeah, I was going to say we'll wrap it there. But thank you very much, Dan and Rick. I think everyone on the call. I know we probably can't get any sound recognition, but I think that was really great. So very much appreciate that. I think yeah, we can just see from the conversations in the chat that it sounds like it's been really interesting, even for me as someone who is just working in the space as a recruiter rather than actually doing it. That was really helpful to learn different things. So yeah, as mentioned at the beginning, for anyone that missed it, Dan and Rick are more than happy for me to share the PowerPoint presentation with people. I think everyone should have my email address, but Dan and Rick's should be out on their LinkedIn's. If you want to get it from me or want me to introduce you, then I'm more than happy to do that as well. So yeah, I just want to say thank you again for everyone for attending, but also Dan and Rick for that. It was very useful, I'm sure, and much appreciated. Perfect. Well, as I said, anyone have any questions, feel free to reach out. And yeah, thank you again, Dan and Rick.
Yeah,
cheers. Thanks, everyone.
Cheers, everyone.
Thanks for the questions. Bye now.